Welcome, everybody. We are broadcasting today from Telematic Media Arts in San Francisco, where we are pleased to present the third in a series of artist talks that we are presenting in conjunction with our current exhibition, House of Reason Truths, Recent Video Art from Africa. The show is guest curated by Kisito Assangi, and it includes works by Halida Boughriet, César Schofield Cardoso, Djibril Dramé, Victor Mudalakesha, Nyansho Nwanri, Harold Offeh, Minette Vari, and Haythem Zakaria. My name is Clark Buckner. I'm the director here at Telematic, and I am pleased to introduce the two artists who will be participating in today's event, César Schofield Cardoso and Harold Offeh. To introduce them, I'm going to formally refer to their bios here. So César Schofield Cardoso is a photographer, videographer, and software developer. His work engages with history, memory, politics, and everyday life, aiming to grasp the complex dynamics that characterize the conditions and possibilities of the place where he was born, Cabo Verde, at the heart of the Atlantic Ocean. Cardoso's work has been showcased in a variety of contexts, including Venice, Saint Tomé, Principal Biennales, Apex Art New York, Hangar Artistic Research Center, Lisbon, S. Baluard Musée d'Art Contemporain de Palma in Spain, La Basse Sous-Marine, Bordeaux. Harold Offeh, in turn, studied critical fine art practice at the University of Brighton, MA Fine Art Photography at Royal College of Art, and completed a PhD by practice exploring the activation of Black album covers through durational performance. Offeh is an artist working in a range of media, including performance, video, photography, learning, and social arts practice. He often employs humor as a means to confront the viewer with historical narratives and contemporary culture, and is interested in the space created by the inhabiting or embodying of history. He has exhibited widely, including Tate Britain and Museum London, Studio Museum Harlem, New York, Miami Art Basel, Museum of the African Diaspora here in San Francisco, Mac Val Museum in Paris, the Kulturhuset in Stockholm, Kunsthal Charlottenburg in Copenhagen. So again, welcome everybody, and welcome César and Harold. We're going to begin with César.
Thank you very much for having me on this show. I'm very excited to be part of this very nice group of people. As you said, I was born and I'm based in Cabo Verde. I would like to give you a brief idea of Cabo Verde, because it's central in my work. Well, Cabo Verde is about 600 kilometers. It's 373 miles west of Senegal in the Atlantic Ocean. We are 10 small islands. We are around 400,000 inhabitants, so a very small country. It was uninhabited before the Portuguese occupied it back in the 1400s. At the time, Portuguese were very actively trafficking people from the African West Coast. Portuguese traffickers used it as a gathering and processing station before sending enslaved people to Americas and Europe. Cabo Verde also served as a supplier of fresh vegetables and animal protein to the ships. But when slavery declined, the colonial power abandoned most of the territory, leaving behind people on their own. Only a small white and mainly mestizo elite stayed and constituted the local authority with the supervision of Portugal, of course. And this fact is important for the understanding of the current ruling class in Cabo Verde. I'll come back to this later. In Cabo Verde, because weather is not best for agriculture, people would suffer from severe famines until the 1950s. The colonial power never promoted fishing or eventually didn't allow it, despite the fact that our seas used to be rich. In the 1900s, whaling in American ships came as an opportunity, although the conditions were miserable. The Cape Verdean immigration began first to the area of Boston, then all over the Atlantic, Europe, Argentina, etc. Nowadays, the diaspora population is larger than the resident population. Only in the US, it's around 600,000 people. I think it's I don't know the exact figure, but it's around that. Nowadays, Cabo Verde is a place of mass tourism, extractive fishing, and foreign investment, mostly from European companies, but also due to its geographic location at the crossroads in the Atlantic. It's hub for drug trafficking with huge consequences for the society. So this was a very brief picture of Cabo Verde, just to give a context for my work. Well, until 2016, I made a living as a software programmer. At the same time, I practiced photography, video, and movie making. Now, I'm a full-time artist, and I mix all my techniques, even programming, software programming, to express my concerns aesthetically. Well, about the piece on this show, in this exhibition, it's part of a broader body of work reflecting on the various manifestations of violence and trauma from the ocean. The Middle Passage, whaling, forced migration are all expressions of violence. On top of that, now we have neoliberalism, extractivism, climate change, and ocean pollution, all affecting coastal populations. More specifically, my piece tackles the current fight for fish on our seas in an unequal power relationship between European industrial vessels and local tiny wooden boats. Due to agreements with European Union, tens of ships are allowed to fish on our waters, causing substantial impact on local fishing. In the piece, people symbolically resist by repairing and resewing the fishing nets over and over. It's a very central in this piece, this gesture of repairing and resisting, and it's been the case since forever. There's a reference to the grueling conditions in the whaling ships. Because of the lack of fish, people have to resource themselves in damaging and dangerous activities. You can see this on the video too. there's an overall sense of threats, but also resistance. In brief, my recent work around the sea summarizes our questions of coloniality, neoliberalism, ruling class that overlook the people, African heritage, popular culture, and dictate one type of aesthetic, a colonial aesthetic. The aesthetic that romanticizes our reality and keeps us from talking about important issues. As a result, contemporary art in Cabo Verde and diaspora is still quiet, so to speak. Meanwhile, there are pressing issues both for concrete living conditions and spiritual thriving. So in brief words, this is my context, this is what I do, and this is what I'm trying to say through my work. I'm concerned with the aesthetic part of coloniality, power relationships, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, César. I appreciate that, and I've got a bunch of questions. I think first we should ask Harold to present, and we can ask questions and converse at the end.
So yeah, and just to say thank you, Clark, and it's really great to be part of this amazing exhibition and gathering of just brilliant artists. I'm feeling very privileged and lucky to be in conversation in terms of the work. So yeah, I mean, just to maybe introduce my practice a little bit, thanks for your introduction as well. Some biographical context. I was born in Ghana, in Accra, but emigrated to the UK as well, quite a small child, via Kenya. So I'm sort of very positioned in a sort of diasporic lane per se. But a lot of my work, which I've sort of developed over the last 20 years, I think has been informed by a relationship to kind of performance and notions of performativity, and trying to use performance as a kind of tool, a research tool, to really explore often histories, historical contexts, situations. And this is often manifested in me using my body, using performance strategies and methodologies. But more recently, I think kind of engaging and collaborating with communities, individuals, working in particular social and institutional contexts to develop various outcomes from events to publications, so on and so forth. But maybe just to kind of anchor things, I'll start by just talking about the work that's in the show. So, excuse me while I just scroll down. So yeah, the work that's being shown is called Two Positions, and maybe just to kind of outline it a little bit. So this work actually emerged from an invitation to develop or create a video work for a now defunct online video website called Kunstvardo, which at the time was based in Norway. And so I was asked to develop a work that would kind of sit kind of online in terms of the viewing experience. And sort of previous to this, I'll kind of go backwards, but I'd made a series of works that were called covers, which were kind of performative reenactments of album covers, particularly of kind of Black female singers from the period of the kind of 60s and 70s, going into the 80s. Starting off with the Jamaican singer, model, actress, all-round phenomena, Grace Jones. but so I'd been using particularly this idea of reperforming these album covers. And again, I'll talk about and show those, put those in a bit more context. But I guess what's relevant to this work is this notion of reenactment, performative reenactment, as a methodology, as a process of kind of engaging with historical images, specifically is what I've been interested in. And what can be learned through the process of trying to embody and reenact a historical image. What's the conversation that comes about from that process? So with this particular work, which is called Two Positions, just to contextualize it, there was an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, in East London, which is sort of quite a prominent public gallery in London, and they'd had they have these archival exhibitions looking at historical moments. And this particular exhibition was looking at the history of these like cultural festivals in Iran. This is before the Islamic Revolution in the late 70s, early 80s. And these festivals had sort of taken place in Shiraz, Persepolis, also in other venues. They were international in their scope and seemed to be kind of mapping different kind of cultural practices. And I hadn't known anything about this kind of context, but within that, there was documentation of this 9th festival that happened in 1975, and documenting performances that took place against the backdrop of the kind of amazing ancient Persepolis sort of site. And one of the performances that was documented was a play by the Ugandan playwright Robert Seramuga Maga, who I wasn't familiar with. There wasn't really that much information to contextualize the work, but there were some images of these documentations of like these performances that had been sort of staged in Persepolis as part of the kind of festival. And I was really intrigued by these kind of positions, these bodily positions. So you had these performers who were adopting these particular positions, one of which is this kind of hanging position, kind of draping. The body was kind of draped. And I was just really intrigued because there wasn't really a context. I didn't know what the play was about. There was no information about the play. I've sort of subsequently been trying to sort of chase bits about the writer and the plays, very little information. Perhaps this broadcast will kind of engender somebody who might know, but I was sort of really, really just drawn to the images, partly because they seem quite sculptural. I was also just kind of, they seem to have decontextualized, obviously. For me, they kind of carried this kind of pathos. There was a kind of weird weight, particularly this kind of like body overhanging that, you know, might speak of a kind of sort of collapse or a death or a, sort of in the absence of this kind of information, I was just really wanting to kind of like explore and think about how this image might resonate and how it might be revivified through the playing and reenacting of it. Yeah, what I decided to do was to kind of perform these positions from the documentation. There were actually 3, but I decided that to focus on 2 and to re-perform them, recontextualize them in a completely different context, which is the UK and not Iran. But to try and, through that re-performance, try and think about the currency of that pose, that gesture, almost as a way of kind of starting a kind of conversation with this kind of like historical work that in a way was a kind of elusive ghost kind of at the time. And this is a kind of way that I've kind of worked before in terms of starting with a source and then thinking about, particularly through this idea of repetition and replaying and reperformance, what might come out of that, what might be sort of generated from that. So yeah, the video is kind of really a sequence of sequences documenting my attempts to kind of perform these positions in the sort of rather more kind of mundane domestic or landscapes of actually Cambridge in England, which is where I happen to live. Not that that's necessarily important. There's nothing really about, I think, the landscape that might suggest it's sort of Cambridge. I was just sort of, I mean, I think there are indicators of kind of urban, suburban landscapes that are quite British, perhaps. So yeah, so the work really became about thinking about this relationship to the reiterative, the reperformative. So it kind of exists as these kind of sequences, and I think it reads in different ways in terms of thinking about the location. So I mean, this image that you're sort of seeing at the moment is, you know, there are the kind of logistics of trying to find the spaces that will accommodate the position. So you need like this kind of railing or some kind of bar in order for like this particular position to happen. So there's a kind of psychogeography that kind of happens with like trying to locate spaces to perform. So they become really the selection of spaces. It's like, where practically can I do this? And then how do I frame this? And also the way that I decided to do this particular work was that there wasn't a crew, there wasn't somebody filming. I would sort of set up the camera and then frame it and then enter the frame, perform it and then leave. So it's a kind of very tight circular work in that there isn't a kind of camera person that's kind of framing it. And really for me, this process really is an investigative kind of sort of tool. Really, it's about kind of gathering, it's almost like a kind of field work, kind of going out, capturing it, documenting it, and then coming back. And then reflecting on the images through quite minimal editing. So the edit is really just like, is kind of in camera really by an entrance, position, hold, exit. And then the sequence is kind of put together as a kind of compendium. I'm sort of aware of the time, so I'll maybe just cycle back to maybe talking specifically about this covers work, which is sort of much longer, ongoing kind of sort of work. Yeah, which I started in 2009, and then actually with this sort of project is what fed into the PhD that I ended up doing and finishing it in 2020. And yeah, an initial kind of catalyst for the works is this album cover of Grace Jones's for the Island Life album, which is like a kind of compilation album that came out in the 80s. But the image of Grace Jones, which many people, or I hope some people might be familiar with, is just like performing this like arabesque one leg kind of pose, very statuesque, this quite androgynous kind of like body. And really just thinking about the album cover as a piece of like design communication that has a particular kind of function, but thinking about it archivally and historically, because I was interested in how album cover artworks are explicitly about identity. So like through marketing, but also particularly images that feature the artist, the performer, they're very explicitly about capturing, marketing, promoting. So it's a kind of framework in which to kind of look at, a portal to look at the particular kind of projection of identity and music of the artist. And so for me, it became really interesting to then think back to these historical figures. And again, I mean, the work kind of operates. So this initial series which I did in a very domestic context, in this like studio apartment that I had in London at the time. You know, the work is consistently about failure, really. And I think all these reenactments are about failure, in that they're attempting to do something that is impossible, in that there are these images, these documentations that exist in a very particular context. And there's an attempt to copy, reenact, or inhabit the kind of space. And I'm interested in the kind of workings and the mechanics of trying to re-perform an image. Like, you really learn about an image if you try and physically embody it. But of course, there's a kind of impossibility. I mean, with the Grace Jones image, I mean, she never even really did that pose anyway, because it's like a kind of composite. They kind of like edited together different limbs and stretched them and airbrushed them. And but for me, the reenactment becomes a kind of annotation, really, of that original image. And it becomes a kind of compendium or kind of companion, and often in the way that I've presented the works. So the works were initially a series of photographs, and then there were live performances, and then there are a number of videos as well. So I'm sort of interested in the slippages between photography, live performance, and video. They're normally contextualized with the original image. So there's a kind of sense in which there's a kind of conversation. And I think going back to the kind of two positions, that's also, it was just slightly different, I think, in that work comes out of a kind of absence of knowledge about the original. But I'm interested in the kind of like, the kind of replay. And it's just to kind of finish off, it's something that I think, you know, at the time when I was starting this work, which, you know, in kind of platforms like kind of social media, social networking platforms like YouTube and stuff that were kind of taking off, and kind of the currency of those, I was really interested in how like lots of the early videos that people were putting up were kind of like, and it's actually been accelerated with TikTok as a platform, but like people were performing like music videos or reenacting things, and just to, so I was really interested in how that within popular culture there kind of sits this whole embodied area of knowledge, often like teenagers recreating like, you know, Beyonce's like choreography or whatever. The investment in that is like really, I think is really, really amazing in terms of like the proximity and conversation with kind of culture. But yeah, maybe that's speaking more to the kind of methodology that undersits the work. But I'm going to stop talking and let's open up for conversation. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Harold. So thank you both for your presentation. I enjoyed them and learned, indeed. It helps me to appreciate the work that I've already been living with in a new way. César, if I could, to begin with you, I'm struck in your presentation of your work and your lens on Cabo Verde, and at the remarkable intersection of the local and the global, that in a way you begin small island, 400,000 people, but then you extend out to a community of Cabo Verdeans across the world, and then also present Cabo Verde as a nexus that is, you know, caught between, and it sounds like too often suffering large global forces beyond its borders. Can you speak more to that experience and the way it informs the work?
Yes. That's why I was commenting with you that we are a small country, but we have like big questions, right? We were born in the Black Atlantic, right? So on the onset, it was already heavy. So Cabo Verde was destined to be this troubled place, and it still is, right? It feels like that nothing really changed that much. Okay, we had independence very late in 1975. But by now, we should have more changes in the society, in the power relationship in the society, in the power relationship with big blocs like European Union and Africa and the US. But the key elements to understand Cabo Verde is the ruling class. That's the one piece that didn't change. The one piece that it pretended to change with independence, but it's still the same. The same colonial mindset, the same partnership with families in Europe and elsewhere. So what we see now in Cabo Verde is simply this. It's simply a game of big interests, big businesses, and very little about liberation, about going back to African roots, let's say. I don't really like this expression, but yeah, reconnect to Africa, reparation, talk about slavery, talk about colonial violence. We are not doing this. So, so this is Cabo Verde, this paradox of being a very tiny territory, but it's a play field of so many forces, like you said, and for me, it's like Black Atlantic continuing. It's the same process. It's the same extractivism. It's the same exploitation. It's the same alliances. It's the same flow. And my work, what I'm trying to do aesthetically is how can I talk about this in one piece with art in a very poetic way, because easily I could be a political artist, but I'm not a political artist. I don't engage with rallies and no, I want to do this with art. So my question is that how can I do it? And I'm trying to figure out how to do it.
That you anticipated my follow-up, because that's an interesting line that you're negotiating there. Indeed, the work is very poetic and beautiful and compelling in its images and its details. Your articulation of the larger context, though, definitely invites that if you're not a political artist, or if you're saying I'm not a political artist, there nevertheless seems to be a kind of activism in the art itself. Is that right? I mean, kind of, nevertheless, there is a politics to the aesthetics.
Of course, even aesthetic is a political matter, right? And that's one of the questions I deal with, the aesthetic, the official aesthetic, how we talk about Cabo Verde, how we show Cabo Verde, how we picture Cabo Verde, the narratives about Cabo Verde, like a blue country, beautiful people, and beautiful beaches, and gentle people, etc., etc. This is the realm of aesthetic, and even literature, and advertising. All these are in the realm of aesthetic. So what I'm trying to do, this is really what I'm trying to do, is how can I build or construct another narrative. It's always political, right? It's always political because all what I'm talking about is political. But what I'm trying to perform is the aesthetic elements of it, the narrative, the imagery, the feelings. So the piece that I put together for this show actually is it's something very bad here. The overfishing, the big ships coming here, and the consequences for the coastal population. It's big. But what I'm trying to do, like you said, is finding a language that it feels like poetic, but it's operating in your brain somehow. Like it's trying to get your attention to details, to the rhythm, to the emotions, to the suffocating feeling of it, but at the same time the resistance, right? The repairing of the fishing net is a gesture of resisting, because it's the same for centuries. I don't know if I answered, but yes.
No, indeed, that is clear to me. And even just putting the contemporary phenomena in the historical context, the combination of contemporary imagery and historical imagery, and again, cracking open the static image of the contemporary. Harold, if I can follow up with you, it's interesting for me to think about your piece in the context of your earlier work and the album covers. The Two Positions piece there's a real formal, and it's funny to say again, but there's a kind of formal beauty about it. And the hanging, the performance of the body, the hanging over the railings and the fences and the like, it enacts this very simple intervention into each of these scenes, yes? And in so doing, it transforms them and activates them in some ways. Like you're talking about the landscape, the distinctly English landscape. In a way, they become landscapes with the presence of the body, with the in the performance. And then there's the impact of the body itself, the weight, the image of it, the image of the black body hanging over the fence, and the sense of gravity, pulling on the body. It's again, beautiful, kind of formally striking image. Thinking about it in terms of appropriation, though, and again, in the context of the Grace Jones album cover that you introduced, it raises all kinds of questions for me about how appropriation works in that way. And there's a way that, again, the Grace Jones, I know that record, and I can't help but, right, there's a kind of resonating tension between the two, and somehow the meaning of your intervention is evoking the earlier image in a way that is, again, sort of part of its meaning in a different kind of way. Whereas in the two positions, the appropriation, it's like source material, it's like inspiration, but it seems to operate differently. Have you thought about that? Is that, were you self-conscious of that kind of going into it, or when you do these different kinds of projects?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, you know, the politics around the process of remaking or reenacting or kind of referencing kind of existing works, I think is, yeah, it's very live. You know, I'm sort of conscious of like what that relationship is, you know. But I mean, I wouldn't necessarily use the word appropriation, although I understand it sort of comes under that, and that's might be a useful kind of framework. But for me, I guess I think about it more through like quotation or citation or like um because I'm really interested in, like I said, that relationship of the process of remaking to the original and starting a conversation with that original. I think the difference with the Grace Jones images is there's a kind of popular cultural currency to that image. And you know, there's a kind of, Grace Jones has a sort of cult-like, I don't know, cult-like maybe, but like there's a kind of niche kind of popular following. I mean, a bit more so since she collabed with Beyonce, which I'm happy that she's a bit more current now. But when I talk to people in their like 20s or like teens, they're like, "Who's Grace Jones?" And now they know. But I think, you know, with you know, with the image of the performance from the festival in Iran, this Ugandan playwright, it's just like the kind of absence and what fills that. So it's the politics that's very different, I think, in that I'm sort of really consciously aware that you know, all I've got are these sources that are quite blank. You know, and I sort of toyed a lot with like how much I should like really try and find out like what the play was and its full context, and then really think through that. So kind of do that kind of rigorous like research sourcing, and I did make some attempts, but I've actually kind of thought, you know what's more interesting for me is the not knowing, is that space of reading into the absence, and really thinking about how source images can be kind of catalysts. I mean, the thing that is important for me that I think sort of steering away from certain strategies, like, you know, like appropriative strategies for me is that citing and referencing, you know, like I'm not claiming this as something that I've originally like conjured up myself. For me, it exists through its referencing, through its citing to this thing, and the possibility that there's somebody out there that does know and that brings a very specific knowledge to it. Or if not, that in that absence, there's a kind of, I mean, because I think with that work as well, lots of people might not even know, maybe that's not even important, but as well, on the other end of the spectrum, that it has this relationship. I mean, I think one thing I should also say is that I kind of, you know, was just really interested in like, historically, maybe it's not so evident within the work, but like, just this exchange of like, cultural practices that I saw in this exhibition at the Whitechapel that was looking at these festivals in Iran, you know, because they were very much focused on like artists from, I mean, what we call the global south now, but from Africa, from Asia, you know, and sort of bringing them to kind of together. And, you know, I mean, this led me to think about and explore like a lot of the sort of Pan-African festivals that sort of happened in the sort of 60s and 70s, and the sort of as a sort of after the sort of glow of like independence in, you know, sub-Saharan contexts. That there's all this amazing work, and for me it was a kind of thing of like I was just really interested in the dynamics and the kind of conversations that were already happening, and the absence of discourse around that in terms of I mean, and I also want to say, you know, it's not unproblematic, you know, like the kind of Shah's pre-Islamic revolution is deeply, deeply problematic. Wouldn't ever want to romanticize that in citing those festivals. But I think what I'm specifically interested in is like, just from the little bits of documentation, because they're sort of very like glamorous brochures of like just documentations of these performances of like, you know, from Guinea-Bissau, somebody comes and does a performance from Vietnam. There's a, you know, is that space of conversation. Like I would love to know like people hanging out and eating together and like seeing other people's shows, and the spaces that was afforded by quite a lot of resources that went into bringing these people together into proximity. So yeah, that's saying sort of, maybe that's background, maybe that's something that's not so evident within the work, but I think was at the time of making it was very important to me.
Yes, that's interesting and helpful. The your remarks at the end here too, specifically that right, that you know the work through an image, like the Grace Jones piece, but in some ways the two are different in that regard, because the one really does sort of deconstruct the album cover, whereas again, the two positions that the focus for me anyway is on you as a performer, right? The sort of performance of your intervention, and that the source material is not an image per se, but is actually a performance and a broader context of performances going on. So the restaging is really, in a different way, kind of more about the staging and what it is to be a performer and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of staging becomes very kind of crucial, and yeah, you're right to kind of like just speaking to the kind of discourse with the landscape. I mean, it's funny thinking about this, because I've been, a subsequent work that I made was these like performance positions in another English landscape, you know, and thinking particularly about like particularly sort of like Black bodies, how they're figured within landscape, in and out of the kind of Western canonical image making tradition. You know, we sort of all know about the kind of sort of, you know, particular recurring figures, the kind of servant, slave, laborer, blah 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 blah, that within the Western canon the bodies appear, and really trying to think about like seeing, yeah, bodies configured differently. So I mean, a lot of people read the two positions as a kind of playing dead. For me, that's a kind of, you know, so like for me, I don't see it as that. I think about it as like that those positions are about draping. They're quite formal. It's like how does the body drape in relation to this bit of like public space, this bit of architecture, this bit of you know, it just so happens that having a Black body brings with it a certain particular framework and a certain particular reading. So like, you know, I've had people talk about like lynching and violence and like, you know, kind of like, you know, and, you know, and I understand that, because there's a currency of those images in terms of seeing bodies, Black bodies in particular landscapes. So yeah, there's a kind of sort of tension, I think, in that kind of image making, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. and the formal qualities, to me, it almost evokes dance in that regard. Beautiful. I mean, sort of the emphasis on the movement, that simple, distilled movement, but
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah. I wanted to ask you, when talking about the violence of the ocean, I was struck by the way in which the violence of the ocean is so directly married to history, and that what you're talking about, right, the Middle Passage, forced migration, the crisis in the fisheries. Can you speak to that, sort of the relationship between nature and history, or nature and the social, in your work?
Um, what do you mean? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I know it may be too abstract, and you just tell me. But just struck to say that you were talking about focus of your work being the violence of the ocean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the violence of the ocean, of course, Cabo Verde, exposed to the Atlantic off the western coast of Africa, right? That it's literally the ocean, and how we respond to sort of the tumult of the sea. But really, what you're talking about a lot of the time are social forces and historical forces. So that when we're talking about when we are looking at the ocean, you're evoking the Middle Passage, or when we're looking at the ocean, we're considering forced emigration or the crisis in the fisheries, so that there's a way that nature and the social seem to be
Yes.
very intimately linked in the work.
Yes. 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 First of all, the ocean as this place of violence, where the violence happens, right? And this trauma, this trauma that is in the back of our minds that we don't talk about, and as a result, we don't reclaim the ocean. And this is the paradox that, for example, Cabo Verde is 14 times more ocean territory than land territory, right? But the blue economy, fishing, is not a big part of our concerns. We let it to the Europeans, to the foreign companies to explore, because we don't feel that is something that belongs to us. So the ocean is this how you say this, at the same time is this place of huge potential as a natural resource, but at the same time it is also something that we fear, we don't want to talk about, we don't tackle, we don't reclaim, we don't write about, we don't, it's not part of, it's not a big part of our culture. So for me it's very jarring, right, how this big ocean is not part of our aesthetic, our literature, our, you know, our visual arts. And I'm not sure if I got your question very well, but I could explain it like this vast natural resource that is right there. The ocean is like 300 meters from where I live. I go almost every day to the beach for exercising, for, you know, because I love it. But at the same time, it seems so distant in our life, in our culture, in our spirituality. So the interweaving of social, political, violence, and nature maybe is in this violent link that we don't unpack, we don't make the catharsis of it. So it's something like it's there, but it's contained. It's not explored. It's something very, very dense, if you will.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it almost sounds like the unconscious, right?
Yes, of course, because trauma and yes, and also every year fishermen die in the ocean, and we have a lot of events, bad events related to the ocean, be it real or psychological. So of course, it's something that is in an unconscious realm, of course, yeah. And that's why I think art that has this power of pushing those unconscious buttons can be a way to talk about it, to tackle it, right? And I hope so, right? I hope that my work could at least break open some of these very dense questions that I'm talking about.
Yeah, that definitely clarifies the specific role, right? To say not just you as a professional artist taking it up in those terms, but art and the aesthetic has a unique job to do. You know, maybe only it can do it in that context.
Hopefully.
Let me ask Harold here. You know, one thing in that juxtaposition, or one contrast is also that one's a video and the other still work. And frankly, it makes me curious to learn more, maybe see something of yours where you're presenting it in a performance context. Yes. And I sort of wonder maybe about that. Like, do you perform in galleries? Do you perform in formal theatrical settings, you know, proscenium arches? But also then working across, you both are working across diverse media, but specifically your performances, right? And how you record them, how they translate. I guess the simple question is like, what's that like? Are they indeed as different as they might seem, or are they, you know, consistent with each other?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the performances have sort of come about in very different contexts. I'm not particularly prescribed or prescribing the way in which the work is kind of seen. So it's happened in, yeah, white cube galleries. It's happened in sort of theatricals, you know, with rake seating and lights. It happened in slightly more informal, like maybe more warehouse kind of sort of spaces. Yeah, I haven't quite done it on the street. Maybe the nudity aspect kind of like, and in fact, I have sort of since finishing my PhD, I've sort of haven't really performed that work live. The work has kind of evolved into that initial series, which was very much looking at kind of images of Black female singers, has kind of morphed into this other series, which is called Lounging, which is looking at this particular pose and posture of quite a lot of sort of popular soul, pop, R&B singers from the 80s, the mid 80s. So people like Lionel Richie and Billy Ocean, where they're all like reclining in this like what I call a lounging position, sort of recumbent splendor. So I've been performing that, which for my aging body is slightly easier, aging and rotund body. I mean, that sort of So, and again, that's become about the anatomy of a kind of like what's in a pose. And I've become really interested in this particular pose because one can read it through the Western canon in terms of ancient and Greek kind of sculptures, or through modernism, figures like Henry Moore, but also like Manet's Olympia and like the Odalisque and so on and so forth. But also then read through other cultures, the other, the reclining Buddha, manifesting, but as then circling back to popular culture, what it means for like in the 80s, these Black men to be in this pose, this like what currency it had then, I'm particularly interested in. So yeah, that's something I've been reperforming and doing workshops with, inviting other people, lounging in like awkward, like on stairways and stairwells as performances, and then, in the street in Japan, I've done it, and for me, it then slips into things like, like the act up dead ins or sleep ins, or like within the public realm, like occupying space by lying, as the kind of, that has a currency of protest there that's very different to, Lionel Richie's Come to Bed Eyes on an album cover, So yeah, but it's become like the anatomy of a kind of pose and how that's kind of stretched out and resonates. So I'm particularly interested in this idea of reconfiguring the work in different contexts, and even in then inviting people to perform it, as a kind of, in one work that I did actually with Tate, they have these public event nights. I sort of staged a sort of studio, a photo studio, where people could choose poses. Most people chose that lounging pose. Maybe it's just because it's easy, but it was really interesting to see people, like I think like 300 people across the night, just like inhabiting and reperforming. And there's an archive that was formed from, these over 350 people kind of performing the same image again and again and again in this particular kind of context. So I think I've strayed away from your question, but
Well, no, in a way that's very helpful, though. Because of the intermediate dimension, I was going off in the realms of theater and dance and so forth. And in a way, where you ended up, it grounds it back into, something you said in your presentation, where sort of understanding the practice in terms of an interrogation of images through performance. And sort of grounding it again in that, in a way of knowing the image and investigating the image's implications, but in and through the enactment of it. It reminds me of like, I can't remember the specific name of the piece, but like the Bruce Nauman piece where he's walking with the unique, kind of the classical sculpture form.
I'm like walking around this, like the rectangle on the ground, and he's like, "Is that one you're talking about?"
Well, it's specifically, I may be getting my wires crossed, but there's one where he's specifically inspired by an apparently, consistent gesture and sort of pose that's used in a sculpture. Yes, but then he's activating it and he's moving with it, and
contrapposto.
Contrapposto, excuse me.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, that's a really good reference. Yeah.
Right. Sort of coming out of the visual arts, but as a performer, but with consistent reference back to, no, this is actually, it's a visual art practice as a performing artist.
May I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think ultimately is about language or languages, right? So I think we all are looking for new languages to talk about our serious problems that we face, because I think for Africans, for even in the diaspora, the political it impacts us so much, our bodies, our imaginary, everything. But at least in my case, when I say I'm not a political artist, I want to be an artist, right? I don't want just to rally or to protest. I would like to find a way to talk about all these questions, all these issues, but being an artist, because oftentimes you find African artists stuck in this place of being an political artist, because they have the urge to talk about their realities and their daily life, etc., etc. I think we are looking for ways of being artists, but at the same time dealing with our big problems, but in innovative ways, maybe. Yeah, I wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, I think it's a really important sort of point, really. I mean, I think in some ways it's to do with the kind of articulation. I mean, I think when I think about politics, I think about a kind of broad spectrum. Like, I think, I think, all artists' work could be looked at through a political lens, in the sort of politics, whether that's the politics of the materials or the way it might resonate. And, some works are then obviously dealing more explicitly than others that are maybe more implicit. But yeah, and you're right. I think often, African artists or artists of the African diaspora, again, are framed through particular cultural and political lenses, regardless of actually what the work is doing. One might kind of question that. But I think it's useful to think about the spectrum. I think, some artists are deliberately trying to be like activistic. So the work is trying to be provocative and sort of like, in some senses can be quite didactic. And, other works, I think, maybe more poetic, and the politics is still there in that there's a kind of critical kind of inquiry. And I think, those registers are kind of all important. I think maybe what I felt like what you were speaking to, César, was a bit of the reductivity that can come with like a kind of political, like the work suddenly becomes just a signifier of like a political movement or a slogan or a kind of, and I think there's a real need to kind of resist that reduction and fixing of the work, like for me, I'm an artist and I'm engaged with art because it's generative. It's like complicated. Sorry.
Yes. No. In my case, because I'm a software programmer too, I hack even the language of video and image. I hack it because the funny thing is we are talking about oppression, colonial dominance with the master's tool and the master's language, right? So how can we break free of it, right? And invent new ways. And I think I'm talking specifically about my work. I think hacking is a good word for me, right? But yeah, I'm listening to you very attentively, and I think somehow it's the same. It's a hacking. It's right what you do, and yes, yeah. I wanted to.
A great word. Yeah, I think that's really it's really useful. Yeah.
For me, one of the unanticipated sort of connections in your work is that there's a real attention to detail that then, and maybe this is what you meant, Harold, by generative, right? But a real attention to particular details that then seem to explode onto the broader context. But somehow there's like the focused attention that seems to go hand in hand with the capacity to unearth these broader implications.
Yeah, and I think there's this kind of sort of slippage. I don't know if it's like a pun, but I'm sort of been really interested in like the notion of like attentiveness and attention, and how that often engenders tension. So attention is created by attention. And yeah. And often I think, you know, sometimes, you know, there are kind of gestures that are kind of like works. I can sometimes, like works are like gestures, you know, they might be like pointing or like, or inviting the gaze, or inviting a kind of reflection, or opening up a space to revisit or to like encounter or experience, you know. And I think that like, I think those works that engender curiosity and speculation for me are really, really important in terms of like, particularly in like kind of like living in kind of like neoliberal capital kind of like contexts, which are so reductive. They're so much pushing us to be not curious, to be transactional, to be reductive, to be sort of technocratic, to be like distracted by like, you know, spectacle, which I am fully like immersed in it. But I think like something, I mean, I'm sort of slipping into politics here, but something that I'm, you know, as somebody that's invested in education, so I'm like, you know, I teach, I often work in like school and educational contexts. I'm sort of like particular, I mean, I can only speak to a UK context, I'm not sure about anyone else, but really there's like this dismantling of like, of particularly like arts and humanities as like sort of like learning pedagogical tools. And with it comes this dismantling of criticality and people's ability to reflect and think about their relationship with the world and the environment and the context, and to find voice and language and the things that we're talking about in terms of like, but you know, I don't, while I think as humans we have the capacity for that, those things have to be nurtured. They need like frameworks to enable them to happen. And I just find this really like at the moment, again, I can only speak to the UK context, like a weird like kind of Fordist mentality where people are like, it's like being channeled towards like this idea of vocationality and professionality and like, you know, education is only for work. It only exists for work and material benefits. And similar with culture. Culture is just something out. It's like, you know, it's so yeah, again, I'm sort of moving away maybe from some of the things I'm talking about. But there's a kind of urgency that I feel seeing the visible dismantling and taking apart of that, and then seeing the struggle that often, particularly young people that I'm working with, who are trying to find language and voice and trying to kind of engage with the world, like particularly those that are existing in marginal contexts, you know, are really, 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 really struggling. You know, I mean, many of them do find a way. You know, we've seen great art and culture kind of born out of that, but there's so much damage that's caused by that lack of infrastructure and that lack of capacity. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Well, for me,
and lack of language and lack of a proper language to speak about this trauma and issues and the daily life too, because for us Africans and Black people, it's ongoing, right? The violence it's ongoing. We are living it every day. So it's so important to put together this kind of shows, to be together, to talk to each other, to know each other, because at the end, we are talking about the same kind of issues, right? Although it's different geographic locations and different journeys, but I believe we are talking about the same kind of issues here.
Yeah, I was going to add, just Harold, that I didn't think those remarks were much of a digression really at all. They seemed to sort of second what César had started off with, talking about political art versus kind of the politics of the aesthetic. Yes, and that you would defend that underdetermination, defend aesthetic underdetermination as itself a crucial social resource, right? And not allow the work to devolve into something that's didactic, which again may have its place, but precisely because the aesthetic has a unique social value, a unique political value.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Encapsulation.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate this conversation and your presentations, and thanks for taking the time to be here today. I think we should probably wrap up and say goodbye to our audiences. But again, let me thank you both, and thank you for your contribution to the show.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to be together.
Thank you very much. I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, I hope we'll continue to, I hope we'll stay in touch and look forward to following your work. So again, thank you. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, guys. Thanks.